Trump has unveiled his latest strategy on Afghanistan and has done another about turn from what he was saying on the campaign trail, this time saying that American troops cannot be pulled out anytime soon. What can we read into his change of tack? And the American Navy has once again experienced a collision with a cargo ship, this time off Singapore. Whether it's because of system malfunctions, sabotage or negligence, what kind of increased risks do the presence of U.S. Navy ships pose to commercial shipping in the region? Welcome to The Point, live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. Killing terrorists, not nation building. U.S. President Donald Trump has unveiled the U.S.'s latest strategy on Afghanistan, but much remains a mystery. In a 30-minute address to the nation Monday, the president said a rapid exit of U.S. troops from Afghanistan was unacceptable, and his Afghanistan strategy will shift from a time-based approach to one based on conditions on the ground. This is a sharp U-turn from his position on the campaign trail when he called for immediate pullout of U.S. troops from Afghanistan. The Taliban has responded by dismissing his strategy as vague and nothing new, and vowed to continue the war against the U.S. and its allies until they leave the country. Why did Trump backtrack from his earlier position? How will this new strategy affect the security and political situation on the ground? And is anti-terror the only reason why the U.S. military is staying put? Joining today's discussion from Washington, D.C. is Dr. Michael O'Hanlon, a senior research fellow at the Brookings Institution, and from Kabul is Harun Mir, co-founder of the Center for Research and Policy Studies. Gentlemen, welcome to the show. Now, Dr. O'Hanlon, let me come to you first. First of all, how do you interpret Trump's strategy on Afghanistan? He has been calling for an end to the war in Afghanistan as soon as possible ever since early 2011, and now he's changed his mind. What are the reasons behind this?
Greetings. Well, I think you're right that he has changed his mind dramatically from what he said on the campaign trail. But I think when he faced the harsh reality that there really were no other good options, and when he recalled and understood fully just how much the counterterrorism struggle involves South Asia, including Afghanistan and the border and tribal areas of Pakistan, I think he realized that to depart would risk losing all American assets, listening and observation capabilities, counterterrorism bases for drone strikes and commando raids, and essentially he would be losing America's ability to go after ISIS or Al-Qaeda or other extremists in that part of the world. Leave aside that the Afghan government would probably fall without the help of NATO. That would obviously be important to some of us, but perhaps less so to President Trump. But for the counterterrorism priority and agenda that he always talked about, I think he recognized ultimately that there was no good alternative to staying and trying to reinforce the foothold that the United States currently has in Afghanistan.
Dr. O'Hanlon, still to you now, what are America's objectives in Afghanistan exactly? Does staying in Afghanistan fit in with the long-term U.S. national interests?
Well, you know, over the very long term, let's say 10 years or more, I think most Americans would prefer to be out of Afghanistan. It's not a central location for broader strategic considerations. It's not like having a base in, you know, Japan or Germany or a place like that where you're really well positioned to a lot of things globally that the United States may want to do. In Afghanistan, you really are not on the way to any other important location that can't be accessed better some other way. So I don't think there's any inherent value for the United States to being in Afghanistan except for the purposes of counterterrorism, as I just mentioned. Now, obviously, to be successful in counterterrorism, we need to have a good Afghan partner. We need for the Afghan government to hold its power, to be able to consolidate control of its territory, and to be legitimate in the eyes of its own people so that it continues to be supported by its population. So even if we're not doing nation building, we need to help our Afghan partner get a little stronger. whatever language you want to use, that has to be part of the mission, even for counterterrorism purposes. But I think that's the American interest in Afghanistan, fundamentally counterterrorism.
Yes, Mr. Mir, from the Afghan perspective now, the Afghan ambassador to the U.S. Called the newly appointed announced policy a 10 out of 10, and that Afghans heard exactly what they needed to. What is your take on this announcement? Is there anything new to his strategy?
First of all, the overwhelming majority of Afghans have welcomed the new decision by President Trump. And certainly it's helping at this current situation the Afghan government, because it's boosting the morale of the Afghan security forces. We are currently in a military stalemate. But there are some changes from the previous administration's policy. Certainly, for example, this time President Trump announced that the assessment of the U.S. mission in Afghanistan will be based on conditions, not on a timetable, which is very important. At least it sends a message to the Taliban and their supporters in the region that the U.S. is not leaving and not setting a time within 2 or 3 years. So that is an important message. And I think the core of the message by President Trump was to ensure that the Afghan government is capable of defending itself, and because the ultimate solution for Afghanistan will be a political settlement. We are all aware and fully agree that militarily we will not be able to defeat the Taliban. However, what we could do is to prevent the Taliban to break the current stalemate in their favor and expand their territory, because in the past 2 years they have taken advantage of the weaknesses of the Afghan security force, and they have expanded territory in Afghanistan. And preventing that, in my opinion, during this summer and during the next year, will be an important achievement for the Afghan government and for the U.S. military in Afghanistan.
Yeah, well, Trump has left the door open to possible political agreement with the Taliban. However, his outreach has been rejected initially by Taliban, who warned that Afghanistan would become a graveyard for the U.S. if America doesn't withdraw its troops. What makes President Trump think that Taliban would be open to negotiations? I mean, the Taliban wants the U.S. and NATO to have a time frame for withdrawals before they could talk, but Trump has said this is not going to happen. Mr. Mir, again.
Well, what President Trump also announced was a combination of military strategy combined with economic and as well as diplomatic efforts. And we know that there has been some diplomatic efforts. For example, the quadrilateral meeting was existing between Kabul, Islamabad, Washington and Beijing. So we have to retake the regional initiative, and it's very important to convince regional stakeholders that the U.S. mission in Afghanistan is also guaranteeing their interest in Afghanistan, because in the absence of the U.S. and NATO, we don't know who could fill the vacuum, and that might be, again, radical terrorist groups such as Al-Qaeda and perhaps IS, which is taking ground in Afghanistan. So I think this option is certainly an important option for us, because we know that regional countries such as China are key and the future stability of Afghanistan, and partnership between the United States and China, Russia and India, Iran and even Pakistan is very, very important for future stability of our country.
We're going to talk about that in just a moment. Dr. O'Hanlon, let me come to you first. I mean, it's estimated that right now about 40% or over 40% of Afghan territory is controlled by the Taliban. That's after 16 years of U.S. presence and, you know, helping the Afghan government fighting the Taliban and terrorist forces. How come that after so long the situation is still so bad in the country? What is going to change in the future, or what Trump said in his strategy announcement that's, you know, going to be promising to bring changes to that?
First of all, I don't think those statistics are quite right that you mentioned. I think that the estimates I've seen are that the Afghan government controls about 60% of the country. It can vary a little whether you measure by population or by the number of districts or by the territory. And then the Taliban control about 10%, and the remaining 30%. So, but that's still, I won't quibble too much, because you're right to be concerned about these statistics, and they have been headed in the wrong direction. The Afghan government has probably lost control of about 10% of the country in the last couple of years, going from roughly 70% to 60%, as I mentioned. So I think is that we can perhaps help the Afghans move back closer to that 70% control. As my good friend in Kabul has said, no one expects immediate military victory. However, if we can reverse the momentum, the Taliban narrative, I think, will be severely challenged. The Taliban has believed now for 5 years or longer that they can simply outweight us, that time is on their side. And as NATO forces drew down, as the Karzai administration left in favor of Ghani and Abdullah, there was always a trend in favor of the Taliban on the battlefield over that entire 5-year period, which would seem to validate the Taliban narrative somewhat. However, if we can change the direction of momentum and start helping the Afghan government take back a few key districts, even in the absence of a military victory, that can still shift things profoundly. It can solidify control of the big cities for the government. It can also send a message to the Taliban that time may not be on their side. And by the way, I don't really think President Trump expects a successful negotiation anytime soon. He's open to it, but that's going to require the Taliban to change its perspective, which in turn requires the Afghan government and NATO to change the battlefield dynamics and momentum.
Yeah, well, on Pakistan, President Trump has vowed to get tough on Pakistan, accusing it of offering safe haven for militant groups. Now, China has said Pakistan was on the front line in the struggle against terrorism and has made great sacrifices and important contributions in the fight. The Chinese Foreign Ministry spokesperson Hua Chunying actually called on the international community to fully recognize Pakistan's anti-terrorism efforts. Mr. Mir, how do you look at Trump singling out Pakistan as the only culprit in the conflict?
Well, we have been saying in the past 16, 17 years that Pakistan is not honest when it comes to its cooperation with the United States in the war against terrorism, and particularly against the Taliban in Afghanistan. There has been ample proofs that Taliban is not cooperating. For example, presence of Osama bin Laden, the Taliban leader, died in Pakistan. The Mullah Omar, the other Taliban leader, was killed by a U.S. Drone inside Pakistan territory. And as far when it comes to China, in the past few years, the Afghan government has more cooperated with China when it comes to counter-terrorism than Pakistan, because the Afghan government has been able to arrest some of the Chinese citizens and then hand over to China. And China is currently cooperating with Afghanistan in counter-terrorism. So I think this is a message to Pakistan. And I think the message to Pakistan is I think there is still a golden opportunity for Pakistan and Afghanistan to come together and resolve the historical problems that dates back from 1947. And if we lose this opportunity, if the United States is not here, if the financial commitment is not here, if the military commitment is not here, I think it will be very difficult for the two countries to come together and challenge the menace of terrorism and radical Islamism, which exists and threatens the stability of both countries.
Yes.
So this is a strong message. We have to wait for the military establishment in Pakistan to see what kind of response they will send.
Yeah, thank you very much, gentlemen. We have to leave it there. Many thanks, Dr. Michael O'Halloran, co-director of the Center for 21st Century Security and Intelligence at the Brookings Institution, and Mr. Harun Mir, co-founder of the Center for Research and Policy Studies in Kabul. And here is my first point. Now, 16 years on, large parts of Afghanistan still under the control of Taliban. Afghanistan is still one of the biggest sources of refugees fleeing the country. President Trump says the U.S. will not be building nations but killing terrorists, and he got the biggest cheer of the night when he said that. But without building the nation, how could you prevent the terrorists from retaking control after you pull out the troops? It was exactly the U.S. who so-called built the nation, or in other words, dictated what the Afghan nation should be like since 2001 in the first place. And without rebuilding the nation, lasting peace will never take hold. And you've been watching The Point on CGTN with Millie Shin. We'll take a short break and we'll be back right after this. Two serious collisions with merchant vessels, some 17 crew members dead or missing. That's what the U.S. Navy have experienced in the past 2 months. In June, 7 U.S. sailors were killed when the U.S.'s Fitzgerald collided with a container ship in Japanese waters near the port city of Yokosuka. On Monday, the collision between U.S.'s John McCain and a merchant vessel in the waters between Singapore and Malaysia left 10 U.S. sailors missing and 5 injured. And aside from these two incidents, in May, another cruiser, USS Lake Champlain, hit a South Korean fishing vessel. How could these collisions happen one after another? Was it sabotage, human error, or system malfunction? I'm pleased to be joined in the discussion from Washington, D.C. by Douglas Smith, former Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, who is also the Managing Director of Kent Strategies, and from Beijing by Professor Wang Yi-wei, Director of the Institute of International Affairs at Renmin University. Gentlemen, thank you very much for joining us. Mr. Smith, now the very latest what we got from on the development is that the top U.S. military commander in the Indo-Pacific region saying at a press conference just moments ago that it will be foolhardy for adversaries of the U.S. to try to take advantage of any perceived weaknesses in U.S. operational capacity. What does he mean? How do you read it?
Well, I would expect nothing less from the top commander in the region. I think what he's saying is that while there was this tragic mishap, and obviously our thoughts and prayers go out to the families of the lost sailors on that mishap yesterday, the commander is saying very clearly, given the heightened tension within the region as we deal with the tensions coming out of North Korea, that while this may have happened to a particular ship in the 7th Fleet, that doesn't mean there isn't a massive array of armaments ready to go into play. So I'm not surprised the least bit about that. But I also think it's an important message coming out of the Pentagon and Navy leadership that they're taking these collisions very, very seriously.
Yeah.
Well, the ship that was involved in the collision yesterday,
is he implying that somebody is,
destroyed.
but he seems to be implying that somebody is trying to sabotage these ships and take advantage of any perceived weaknesses in the U.S.
I don't know if
capacity. Yeah, how do you look at that?
I don't know if I would read into that. I think he is doing what any
these
commander
are his original
needs to do,
words.
keep his forces up and
yeah.
I think he is just trying to keep his sailors, the men and women under his command, up and ready and aware of the situation, and making very clear to one adversary, and I think that one adversary is North Korea, that don't take this mishap as a clue that we're not ready to go. But I'm not the least bit surprised about it. I mean, that's what he needs to do.
Yeah, Professor Wang here in Beijing, what is your take on what we have just heard?
Well, because of the United States, the relations with the North Korea, I think in recent years, was to go to the more dangerous way because of the concept about the North Korea can even launch the missiles, attack not just in Guam, but even in long term, the homeland of the United States. That the United States cannot accept it, so send more ships and warships and navigate from the South China Sea to the East China Sea and even the Yellow Sea. So it made more tensions between the Navy and between the U.S. Navy and also Chinese Navy, maybe also between the Chinese with the North Korea. And this is, I think, what are the situations we are witness.
Now, these collisions have all been between U.S. warships with commercial ships in the region. By the way, it's also one of the busiest commercial shipping lanes in the world. What kind of risks do you think the presence of U.S. warships have brought to the region?
Well, because the dynamic economy of the Asia Pacific, particularly in the South China Sea, which 70% of the trade lines pass through the Malacca Strait and along this sea. So more and more ships pass through this area. They have their own lines and then have the order. But now, because of the more military warships, they also pass this through. And then they give more, I think it's more challenges to the normal commercial passage of the commercial ships. So that because of that, and then and sometimes they are not have such kind of situation before. So, for instance, this time they happened in the South China Sea in the early morning at 5 o'clock. So the radar even turned off of the Navy, and then the commercial vehicle, the cargo ships is very big, and it's difficult for them to turn the another direction to avoid this from happening. Also, the warship, the United States, the Navy warships, and they can also not the radar also, because it's turned off, they cannot make the target and to avoid from this happening. This also reminds us that there are many tensions because of the increasing the Americans' military deployment and activities. So
Yes.
who is challenging the so-called freedom of navigation? Now I think it's the body. I think they will answer more clearly.
Mr. Smith, actually, maybe a technical question to you. It is a little bit unperceivable, how to say, that these two ships, such ships, big ships, would be colliding against each other in today's world. We're not talking about Titanics anymore. It's just unbelievable that, you know, this kind of thing would happen. So whose fault could it be? Is it the commercial shipping that rammed into the warships, or the Navy ships should have done a better job?
Look, I think it's still early on in the investigation. From the early reports, it would appear in this latest mishap that there was a catastrophic failure of the steering mechanism of the naval ship. You know, the reality is that, you know, the Arleigh-class destroyers are incredibly nimble and fast ship, and that if it is a 800-foot-long cargo ship bearing down on it, you know, the Navy ship, you know, should be the one to get out of the way. It has greater maneuverability. It has state-of-the-art radar, 360-degree radar that can scan over the horizon. It's one of the features of this ship that makes it such a powerful force in the United States Navy. So, you know, while, you know, many would say that it should be the cargo ship, the reality, these cargo ships run on very, very tight timelines. They leave port. They're set to autopilot. You know, every extra inch they move costs money, and it's all about saving money as they move this cargo around the world. And just the one last thing I would say, and where this collision happened, it is incredibly busy. I mean, they average 85,000 large cargo ships going through that strait every single year. So the opportunity for collision is high, you know, and I think that the Malaysian government, Singapore, China, you know, I think they'll all have to look at ways to enhance safety within that very, very
maybe
busy and
mostly
dangerous
the United States send less warships into the region. That would make the chances of collision smaller, obviously, from what we heard. But Mr. Smith, I find this interesting because after the Fitzgerald collision, according to New York Times report, there were radar officers working on the bridge and combat information center below and should have spotted the freighter's image on their screens. One sailor reportedly wrote the paper, "All I can say is somebody wasn't paying attention," and the commanders of the ship have been relieved of their posts. Clearly, they appear to have been held responsible for the incidents, but some other people are pointing to the possible role or involvement of Russia and China in this, citing cyber sabotage or interference. What is your take to that?
Yeah, my take is it was completely based upon personnel error, and that typically, unfortunately, late at night on these ships, it's the more junior members of the crew that are responsible for taking the night watch. And I think what we'll see when the full report comes out is that it was complete human error, unfortunately, on this ship. And I think the U.S. Navy, you know, commander has already indicated a one-day, a rolling, it won't all happen at once, but a one-day stoppage for ships operating in there, you know, to ensure that proper safety measures are in place. You know, the reality is that these ships are so technologically advanced, they have such tremendous forward viewing radar, that the notion that they didn't see it on radar is absurd. I think tragically what happened is human error on this part. And I think the Navy is doing everything it can to ensure enhanced new training, better safety, to prevent this from happening again.
Yeah, Professor Wang, there are people, as I mentioned, there are people alleging Russia and China's involvement in the collisions. A Fox News report quoted a founder of a cybersecurity firm who said it cannot be coincidence that both these ships belong to the 7th Fleet and both have collided with other ships. The same interviewee also pointed to the possibility of involvement of Russia and China without any evidence. How well founded is such suspicion?
Well, it's a cliche that every time there's a cyber attack, then we identify them with Russia or North Korea or Iran. So I think there's no reduced test. Actually, from these collisions, again and again, this is the 6th times. The whole challenge of the freedom of navigation is not China, it's the United States. I think it's, people understand. So that the relations between China and the ASEAN, including the Philippines and the Vietnam, on the code of contact in the South China Sea is improving greatly. But long term, I think the code of contact, not just the countries within these areas, but also the most powerful external force, like the United States, also should be included in the future kind of contact. Otherwise, these kind of collisions will be happened from again and again, and then they make the excuse that is China to make the problem, but actually it's not the case.
Mr. Smith, your final take?
Yeah, look, I mean, I think we live in a deeply complex world at the moment with many tensions, with countries in the region claiming territories on their own. And I think as we see these escalations, it's ever more important for, on the military level, that the commanders within the United States Navy, within the Chinese Navy, within the Malaysian, all work offline to ensure the safety of the open seas. I mean, there are a tremendous number of open seas treaties that merchant ships follow, and I think what we'll see here is closer cooperation working amongst the navies. Unfortunately, I think sometimes bad luck just comes in threes, as they say, and I think this is a case, unfortunately, where the U.S. Navy has had a string of bad luck, and the question will be, how quickly do they learn from these mistakes? How quickly did they get their sailors back in some training to ensure that these things aren't happening again? Because ultimately, the last thing that the U.S. Navy wants to do is collide with a merchant marine ship. No one wants to see innocent life lost.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. We have to go. Douglas Smith, former Assistant Secretary at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, and Professor Wang Yiwei, Director of the Institute of International Affairs at Renmin University. And here is my last point. There is now to be a broader review of all 277 U.S. naval ships worldwide, but especially of the 7th Fleet that is based in Japan, as it has suffered 4 major shipping incidents in the Western Pacific since February. That should give everyone cause for concern, as the area is one of the world's busiest shipping lanes. It raises the risk of collision for commercial ships when so many U.S. Navy ships are busy conducting all kinds of maneuvers in the region, be it so-called freedom of navigation drills in the South China Sea, or large-scale military exercises to deter the DPRK, or joint drills with the navies of other countries such as India and Australia. It is unfortunate that sailors have been killed and injured because of these collisions, and China has also offered assistance in the search and rescue of missing U.S. sailors out of humanitarian reasons. But for U.S. media outlets such as Fox News to suggest possible Russia or China involvement in the collisions is taking it a step too far. That's all from this edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Twitter or visit our Facebook page using the handle The Point with Alex. Download the application CGTN Live to watch our show on your mobile devices, or go to YouTube and look for CGTN The Point. Thanks for watching. You've got The Point.